All right, we're going to start the last lecture for the semester. This is the lecture on avian conservation. And there's quite a bit to talk about in this chapter. I've tried to condense it into a relatively tight narrative. Hopefully, it doesn't take too long. In general, when we think about conservation, when we think about our impacts on conservation, we have to understand that we have an incredible capacity given our technology and human psychology and the influence of capital and various other things. We have a tremendous capacity to inflict harm on the natural world. At the same time, we also have a tremendous capacity to be great stewards of the world. An example of one of the most famous avian species in conservation, where we uh, did a very poor job of protecting a species, would be the passenger pigeon. And this is a species that was tremendously abundant here uh, in throughout our history. In the early 1800s, there were literally billions of passenger pigeons. So understand the bird on the left here is a passenger pigeon, a famous one actually. Um, Billions. There was an estimated about 5 billion passenger pigeons, and there's a lot of information on the history of this. It's extremely sad. I will give you the very short version of this story. So in the 1800s, uh, it became very popular to hunt these birds, even just as a sort of as a for fun kind of thing, but also for food. People ate them, and people had competitions to see how many of them they could kill, etc. And there were so many of them that at that time that they were known to blot out the sun with the size of the flocks that would fly overhead. Like I said, there were billions of them, and they moved in really large flocks. Also, they are very social species, and they would roost in extremely large roosts with presumably tens of thousands of individuals. Um, but it became such a prolific thing to go out and kill thousands of these birds at a time. You could just fire one shotgun into the sky and kill a dozen birds in one with one shell, or more for that matter. It became such a prolific thing that their numbers started to dwindle, and in the latter half of the 1800s, that became a really big problem, and their numbers dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. And ultimately, some laws were passed in Michigan to attempt to protect some of the last roosting sites of the passenger pigeon. They were not enforced very well, and the passenger pigeon goes extinct. And in 1914, actually, the very last passenger pigeon, Martha, dies in the Cincinnati Zoo. 5 billion. That's a lot of birds. It's hard to fathom a billion of anything. 5 billion is a tremendous number of individuals. We killed them all. We managed to kill them all. Um, it's an incredible thing to think about, and it really shows just how incredibly powerful people are in determining the outcomes of populations of animals. It doesn't have to be birds, right? It can be anything. To give you an idea of the number of individuals in a modern context, so the bird on the right there is a red-billed qualia. There are maybe an estimated maybe a billion of them in their range. So that's only 20% of the sort of estimated peak size of the passenger pigeon, passenger pigeon population. That's a passenger pigeon population. Some good alliteration. Um, and that's probably the most numerous bird that exists today. So just gives you an idea of how numerous these individuals were, and we were able to wipe them out. So we can wipe out anything. If we can wipe them out, we can pretty well wipe out anything. If you really go and read about the passenger pigeon, you will probably get a little choked up. It's really a brutal story when you read about the final roosting site and everything that goes along with that, and the story of the last captive passenger pigeons. But I'm not trying to make you cry. I'm just trying to give you a little overview of avian conservation. So let's look at some history. So we're just going to work fairly quickly through the past 300 years or so. If we look at the 1700s, essentially conservation's not really a thing for the most part in the 1700s. There were some hunting regulations for upland game birds in North America and also for the great auk in Canada, but for the most part, conservation didn't exist in any form. Certainly, it wasn't called avian conservation at that time. In the 1800s, we get things like Michigan attempting to protect the passenger pigeon. So people starting to notice, hey, like, remember those giant flocks that blotted out the sun? I haven't seen any of those in a long time. Maybe we're shooting too many of them. And so there was at least an attempt made. It was, albeit an terribly poor attempt with no enforcement. It's a great example of how laws on paper are only effective if they are enforced. And then in New Zealand and the UK, there were some other laws passed to protect some of their bird species as well. Overall, though, most of these early laws were aimed at creating hunting seasons and hunting regulations. They were not, in any case, outright bans on killing anything. Now, in the 1800s, one of the groups of birds that was hunted quite fervently were the Ardeids. So here we have a great egret. And what you might notice on this great egret is it has these long, elegant, beautiful plumes. And those plumes were extremely popular in women's fashion at this time. So you would have plumes, for example, like usually it would be associated with headwear, like you'd have a hat or something, it would have a big plume on it. And that could be a symbol of status and beauty. Stolen beauty, stolen from the bird. But nonetheless, that was the style of the time. And so these birds were, many Ardeids were hunted in a similar fashion to the passenger pigeon. Not in that there were billions of them flying across the sky, but they were hunted relentlessly without consideration for their populations, and many of them were pushed to the brink of extinction by these hunting actions. Here you can see a woman with some feathers on her hat. So these feathers were incorporated into dress at this time. In response to this Ardeiid hunting and some of the other, species that people saw declining, a number of organizations were formed in part as a way to try to protect some of these birds. So the American Ornithologist Union was formed at this time, the Audubon Society, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. They were all formed in the 1800s. As we transition into the earlier portion of the 1900s, uh, laws are still not being well enforced. So, like harvest limits and things like that aren't particularly well enforced. You'd have to do something pretty egregious um, to get in any significant trouble, if at all. And so, as a result of this, conservation organizations realize that there's no way to, you can't force the government to enforce these harvest laws. But if you develop laws that affect trade, you might be able to limit hunting in that way. And so this creates some of the pressure that ultimately results in things like the Lacey Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So the Lacey Act, at least in its initial inception in 1900, the idea was, what if we just ban interstate commerce of animal parts that are harvested illegally? So even like it might have been illegal, for example, to harvest some of these ardeids in, let's say, coastal Georgia. Um, but if Georgia wasn't enforcing those laws, it didn't really matter, right? They could just still go and hunt them and then take their plumes and sell them. So what they said was, what if we made it difficult to sell the product that came from the bird? And so the initial Lacey Act, the idea was, is we're going to ban interstate commerce, which means if you go to Georgia and illegally harvest these feathers, and you drive across state lines with those feathers to sell them, you're now breaking another law. You're breaking the Lacey Act. And in that way, it made it more risky for people to sell these feathers and helped control ultimately the harvest. Because if it was quite financially risky to try to move these feathers around and sell them in other places, then it was uh, less lucrative, and so people didn't do it as much. So that's the Lacey Act. Now, the Lacey Act has been amended several times over history, and now it really controls a great deal of trade at federal and state levels, and even local levels. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is uh, essentially made it so that it was illegal to do almost anything that you could think of. You can see the list of adjectives here: pursue, hunt, capture, kill, possess, sell, purchase, barter, etc. Uh, Anything involving a migratory bird. That would include a part of the bird, its nest, or eggs. It made it illegal to even have one in your possession. So this is why, like, if you find a warbler feather while you're walking around outside in the forest, it's technically not legal for you to possess that piece of that bird, even though you didn't harvest that bird or take it yourself. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act makes that illegal, and all the amendments and uh, addendums that come after 1918 as well, like, expand on this whole thing. So, for example, as we signed various international treaties with Canada, Mexico, and other places, the treaties and the things we agreed to have been integrated into the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And that makes a lot of sense because migratory birds, they don't care about the boundaries of countries, right? A bird that migrates, say, like from, let's, uh, like say Wilson's warbler that breeds up in Canada, but is going to move through the United States during its southward migration. Um, it doesn't care about the line that we have arbitrarily drawn between Canada and the United States. It migrates across that border. And so these treaties and the incorporation of these treaties into the Migratory Bird Treaty Act serves to protect this bird across international lines. Another thing happening in the early 1900s and actually kind of starting really in the late 1800s, but uh, most of it's happening in the early 1900s, is the creation of uh, preserves. So, wildlife preserves and sanctuaries, the National Wildlife Refuge System, which is born with Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge in 1903, and then all these national parks and national forests and things as well. Of course, the first national park is Yellowstone, which was formed in the 1870s, like 1872, I think, is when it was formed. So let's move on to the mid 1900s. So in the mid 1900s, something really, for at least for us, I think, as students in a class like this, something really great happens. A few different pieces of writing come out, and these are not the only ones. But these are some of the ones that are the most famous and maybe the most influential. A few famous pieces of writing come out that start to influence public perception and political perception about the importance of our environment and the importance of the conservation of species. One of those is in 1949. It's the Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, which has some beautiful conservation writing in it. There is a piece from that book. There's one section. It's very, very short, just maybe 3 pages or something. It's called Thinking Like a Mountain. I think you can probably Google and find an excerpt from that. And it's a very striking piece of writing. It might be the most famous piece of writing from the entire book. And it is very much so worth reading. I would recommend any of you go and look that up. In 62, Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring. And Silent Spring is all about Rachel Carson going, where the heck are all the birds? There are no birds singing. That's why it's a silent spring. What this book is really about is the effects of unregulated use of a pesticide called DDT on birds and other animals as well. But the big emphasis is birds. And this book was very, very popular. People picked this book up, people were reading this book, and it was making people really concerned. And as they had right to be, because this pesticide was being used without any form of regulation whatsoever. And at the time, it made sense. In the context of our knowledge at the time, the way we used the pesticide made perfect sense. We just used it liberally all over the place to kill all pests. It was one of the most effective chemicals ever produced to do such a thing. It also, at least in the quantities that we were spraying it in, had some serious effects on avian populations and other animals as well. So her book is about this problem and draws huge public attention. Now, if you want to get anything done politically, you have to have the majority of public opinion on your side. And that is ultimately what she did. She got people to go, hey, this is a big problem. We need to save these birds. We need to stop doing this with DDT. And really ratcheted up the entire conversation about these kind of problems. And then the guy on the right there is Linton Caldwell. He wrote in 1963 a paper called Environment, a New Focus for Public Policy. And what the idea of that paper was very straightforward. It's right in the title. We should be thinking about the things we do and how they impact the environment as a part of our general public policy. Linton Caldwell would go on after writing this to become the architect of a law called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, in 1970. And so NEPA gets created in 1970, and NEPA is a very interesting law. I used to teach a class on it's called environmental policy and regulations, but in many cases it was very law focused. And so we looked at NEPA. And if you look at NEPA and you compare it to like any other law, federal law, NEPA is just like a few pages long. Many federal laws are hundreds and hundreds of pages long. This is a very short, straight to the point law. What it does a couple things. It forms this thing called the Council on Environmental Quality, which is in and of itself an important thing. But the big thing it does is it says when the government, when the United States government performs any sort of action, like say for example, we're going to construct a dam, or we're going to construct a military base, or we're going to fund some project that someone else is going to do, and they're going to construct something. We have to look at what environmental impacts we're going to create through that action, and we have to consider all of the reasonable alternatives to that action. It doesn't say anything about like you have to do those alternatives, but it says you have to sit there and consider them all. Legally you're required to do that. And so that's NEPA. And what it really is a declaration by the United States in 1970 that we're going to start taking some responsibility for um, the stewardship of our environment. And it's a very strong statement. And NEPA is the first law like it in any country. And other countries see that and they're like, that's actually a pretty good idea. And several other countries follow suit. And many other countries today have similar types of laws. Also in 1970, the EPA is created. The EPA is created for a couple different reasons. Some of it had to do with executive branch reorganization, but also in part as a response to NEPA as well. And they are responsible for enforcement of the rules set forth by NEPA. After NEPA in 73, we get the Endangered Species Act, which gives legal protection to individual species. And then there's just a suite of other environmental laws that just comes after this. One after the other after the other. Every couple years, it's like we're getting a new law. And so you get the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, um, CERCLA, RCRA, TSCA, FIFRA, um, SMACRA, probably some others in there. I can't remember. There's a bunch. That's the point. This slide, if it wasn't hyper condensed, is essentially like an entire class, like where you can. That's what environmental law is. It's looking at all um, these different laws and the policies that underlying these laws. So there's a ton of things that come out of this 1970s push for environmental protections. We also get around this time the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, IUCN, and the development of CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, that creates a global agreement to monitor, regulate, and prohibit the international trade of species in need of global protection. So it's sort of like the Lacey Act at the international level, and it's an agreement between all these different countries to enforce this. All right, so from all of this, skipping ahead a bit, or sort of skipping some pieces of narrative along the way, we ultimately get conservation biology. There's also environmental science comes out of that same flow. Environmental science actually becomes before conservation biology, uh, at least a little bit by 5 or 10 years. But we get conservation biology. And so what is conservation biology? Well, it's a highly, um, what's the word I'm looking for? I'd say integrated discipline, where multidisciplinary is actually the word I was looking for. It's a multidisciplinary study where you take ideas from things like ecology, population biology, evolution, genetics, animal behavior. It's not limited to animals. Plants, of course, are also relevant to this discussion. And you fuse them into this whole new discipline called conservation biology. And the focus tends to be on the relationship between what humans are doing and what those impacts are doing to organisms, the decline of populations and extinction of organisms. In general, we consider in conservation biology there to be 5 steps to achieve conservation. First is understanding avian. This is for birds in the context of birds. This stuff applies to other groups of animals just the same. It's just the book, it's an ornithology class, so it puts these things in avian context. So um, when I say avian, I just mean life in general, really. So understand natural conditions of avian autoecology, populations, and communities. That's what we did, most of this semester. We talked about autoecology. That's the study of these organisms at the level of the individual. How does an individual live? Populations. A couple weeks ago, we had a population level lecture, and then communities. Just last week, I think it was, we had our community level lecture. So we have to understand all these things as a part of achieving conservation. That's why we learn about these things. We have to look at the sort of natural state, which is described by those things we were just talking about, and then figure out how humans might disrupt those things. How might humans disrupt populations or communities or the individual sort of autoecological level of a bird. And then when we see that, or we see a disruption in that, we have to make some sort of prediction or develop some idea of how we can restore the natural condition that was disturbed by humans. And then we have to develop a plan to do that restoration process, to undergo that restoration process, and how to then maintain that restoration once it's established. Because if you fix something but don't continue to maintain it, of course, humans can come right back in and tear it down again. And then another important thing in all of this process is considering alternative strategies. We always have to be thinking about new ways to approach these things. And we have to think about, is there a better way to do this? One that maybe is less impactful to humans, but gets the same result, for example. Ultimately, the whole purpose is to defend against extinction. All right, so the Anthropocene. We're going to talk about recent extinctions. I'm going to try to make it brief. There are many, many recent extinctions we could talk about. I want to try to put humans and our existence in the context of geologic time, because I think this is important to understand. So the Anthropocene is the period of time in which humans have been the main force of planetary change. The dates for the Anthropocene are not entirely agreed upon. Some geologists, who are the people that do the arguing about these things, would put the Anthropocene somewhere between 12 to 15,000 years ago or so, whereas others, as you can see here in this example, start the Anthropocene at 1950, very, very recently, only 76 years ago. But either way, whether it's 15,000 or 76, those numbers seem very far from each other. But if you look over the history of geologic time, essentially they might as well be the same amount of time. It's a very small duration. That's all of the time that humans have been having what we would consider to be very significant impacts on our environment. The genus Homo, of which we belong to, is a genus of the early Pleistocene, which you can see on this figure here. There, somewhere around 2 million years ago is when the genus Homo arises in the fossil record. The more modern human anatomy within the fossil record shows up only 300,000 or 400,000 years ago or so. The exact dates are always changing a bit. So I don't know where we're at right now with that, but it's somewhere in that range. So it's like the mid Pleistocene. It isn't until, so if we just say it was 300,000 years ago, it took another 245,000 or 285,000 years or so um, to get to the point where we were really having a major impact on uh, the global environment. So, just real quickly, I want you to think about this. It's somewhat crazy to think how influential we are. Um, if you look, this is all of Earth's geologic time mapped out. I love this kind of stuff. This stuff excites me, and that's the only reason I've included it here. I'm a bit of a fossil nerd, and so looking at this stuff makes me happy. Uh, you've got a little over 4 billion years of Earth's history. Where's the Anthropocene? Where is it? Well, here's all the way back at the very beginning. And we can see as we move up these scales, we move up through time. And so here's our most recent time. There's the Holocene, which just as a reference, here's the Holocene on this figure. You can't even see the Anthropocene on here. That's how thin of a line it is. We have been having an effect on our planet for essentially the blink of an eye, but the significance of our impact is tremendous. In terms of just bird species alone, uh, our actions within the context of the Anthropocene um, have led to something like 8,000 species of extinctions. This is based on the fossil record. If you, not just looking at birds, but if you look at the totality of species that have gone extinct as a result of, or potentially as a result of, human activity, we have had the same sort of impact on the Earth that the Chicxulub meteor impact had. Our our activity has, in terms of extinction, has a very similar sort of impact to an actual meteor smashing into the Yucatan Peninsula, throwing, uh, tephra up into the air, filling the sky with darkness, creating tsunamis, triggering volcanic activity, creating wildfires, just generally being dramatically destructive on like biblical scales, right? That's the Chicxulub meteor impact. If you read about it, sounds like something out of the Old Testament. Our impacts on species on this planet is not dissimilar from that. It just doesn't look so destructive because of the way we do things. The main point is whether or not we are the Chicxulub meteor impact or not, is that we have dramatically increased extinction rates far beyond the normal background levels that we would expect. So some quick examples of relatively recent avian extinctions. There are many more of these in your book, and many more of these in general that aren't covered by your book. So we have Merriam's territorn, which was in western North America, went extinct about 10,000 years ago. This was an absolutely tremendous bird. I am personally quite sad that it's not around. It had a wingspan of about 4.3 meters. Now, in comparison, the largest wingspan today is an albatross. They have a wingspan of something around 3.5 meters. So this is almost, so around 20 something percent larger. and wingspan. This is a huge bird, absolutely monumental. And it fed on late Pleistocene megafauna, so it fed on large, so the large vertebrates of the late Pleistocene. If I recall, some of these fossils have been found in, I think, like the Libray tar pits and some of the other tar pits out west, and in association with some of the megafauna they would have been trying to prey on. Those megafauna went extinct due to climate change and human hunting, and of course, that influenced the success of this species. It was competing directly with humans for those resources. This is just a two kind of like rough scale example. I think this is in the book, I'm pretty sure, showing some modern birds we're familiar with, things like red-tailed hawk, turkey vultures, and condors, and comparing it to how huge Merriam's Territorn is. It's huge. The largest bird ever was the elephant bird, which existed in Madagascar. And we are all familiar with the ostrich, so here we have a comparison of size between the ostrich and the elephant bird. Well, Madagascar was colonized something around 1,000 years ago or so, and um, the colonists needed grazing land, and they cut down a lot of the forest and converted it into essentially grassland, which ultimately had a huge negative effect on the elephant bird. There is some archaeological evidence for hunting and consuming of eggs of this species. So there's archaeological evidence showing elephant bird eggs around campfires, for example. But overall, there's not incredibly strong evidence that it was subsistence hunting that was the major issue for this bird. And it was probably the habitat destruction that was the major issue. Possibly the most famous of all extinct birds, the dodo of Mauritius Island, went extinct in 1662. And so we all know the dodo. Many of you may already know the story of the dodo, but in general, we know that you use the word dodo to refer to someone that's stupid. The idea was, well, these birds were stupid, or they wouldn't have gone extinct. The travelers that stopped off this island wouldn't have been so easily able to eat them if they were smarter. But that's not really true. The truth is these birds were naive. They did not evolve in a place with humans, and so when humans stopped by the island, it'd be sailors, right? These sailors, and we're talking the 1600s. It's not like you're sailing on a Caribbean cruise ship here. This was a rough time to be out and be a sailor. So when they were sailing by and they needed food, this is a place they could stop off. And the dodo was not afraid of people, really. And it was fairly easy for these sailors to get off on the island and literally just sort of herd some of these birds up onto the ship and then set sail again. That was going to be food for later, right? And that's because the dodo, it didn't know any better. It was naive to the situation. There is no complete specimen, specimen of a dodo in existence today, but there are incomplete specimens. Like you can see this specimen that is the head of a dodo bird here. It's very sad to look at. Much more recently, the bush wren of New Zealand went extinct at around the early 1970s. Was highly affected by invasive species brought to New Zealand via ship. Ships have caused a great deal of ecological problems on this planet. That's just the reality. So in this case, stoats and rodents that were carried to New Zealand via the ship got off the ship, and then this ground nesting birds in New Zealand hadn't evolved to deal with those animals, and those animals killed and pushed many of them to extinction. This is not unlike the brown tree snake in Guam. Or is the brown tree snake brown? Whatever the snake is in Guam, where you have a bunch of animals that did not evolve to deal with this invasive species that then suddenly have this invasive species present and they go extinct. um, there was an attempt to save this species, and a translocation was attempted, and we'll talk about translocation in a little bit. Basically, they tried to take the species, put it on another island without the predators, but it didn't. It didn't succeed, um, and so the species is extinct now. The Bachman's warbler. This is a species of the southeast, or was a species of the southeast. It is extremely likely to be extinct. No one's seen one since 1961. Probably pretty fair to say it's extinct. Though there were a few unconfirmed reports in the 80s. And what happened with this species is basically conversion of its breeding ground habitat and overwintering habitat. Remember that to protect a migratory species, you have to protect the breeding habitat, you have to protect the overwintering habitat, and you have to have the appropriate stop-offs along the way. There has to be habitat for resting as a bird migrates. All of that has to be present. And in this case, the bird got a really bad situation on both ends. And I just included one more in here. There's many, 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 many more examples. So the ivory-billed woodpecker, also of the southeastern United States, is very, 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 very likely extinct. In my personal opinion, it's extinct. There have been various times over the years where there have been unconfirmed reports. No one has seen one in a very long time. One of the big problems with this species is they require dead trees in old growth forests specifically, and we've cut down so much forest. There's just not a lot of good, large, old growth type forest that even exists anymore. So things like logging are a big problem, and also fire suppression is a big problem. So in the southeast, a lot of and actually I think this is going to come up again in a little bit, but those ecosystems are like designed to burn. Burning is actually an important part of the cycles that those forests go through. But oftentimes fires are suppressed by people. One of the things this does is it reduces the number of standing snags for these birds to construct their nests in. Another problem for this bird was actually the loss of the passenger pigeon probably negatively affected this bird, because passenger pigeons, which would have uh, at at various times, depending on season, have been down in these forests. It's thought that the sheer weight of a flock of thousands and thousands of passenger pigeons actually would have damaged some of these trees, even killed some of these trees, and created some standing snag habitat, and also that the amount of excrement released by that many birds would have completely annihilated the understory in these forests and created a very specific forest structure. But they're gone. So that also affected potentially the ivory-billed woodpecker. So those are some examples of recent extinctions. Again, there are many more. So your book talks about life history traits. So what life history traits are just um, they're specific measures of the life of an animal. There are things like, uh, these this giant list here. It's a nest dependency duration, the juvenile dependency duration. Uh, when does the bird first breed? What sort of mating systems are present? How big is a clutch? What's the reproductive lifespan? And does the bird undergo dispersal or migration? So these are life history traits. These life history traits are determined through they're traits accumulated through evolutionary time in different species, and every species has their own particular set of life history traits. It's the interaction between these traits and the environment that determines major aspects of the population dynamics for a species. So, what are the big things that we talked about in the population chapter? Birth rate, death rate, immigration, and emigration that determine uh, the flux in a population size and whether or not a population is going to grow or decline at any given time. It's the life history traits that determine that, again, along with interactions with the environment. And some of this is going to be a little, this part's, I think, probably straight review from the population chapter. But remember, in general, generalists are less prone to extinction than specialists because they're very flexible. That's in general. But remember, in stable conditions, specialists are fine. It's that instability leads to specialists being far more effective than generalists would. We can classify different bird species based on their distribution, abundance, and their habitat specificity into rarity forms. And there's a table in the book of these rarity forms. I think I have it in this PowerPoint as well. So let's take a look at some of these rarity forms. First, we have rarity form 1. These are birds that have a wide distribution, small local populations, and broad habitat tolerance. An example would be continental raptors. There are many of them. The one I have here is one that I think most of you would be familiar with, is the red-tailed hawk. So wide distribution. Basically the vast majority of North America, all the way down into the Caribbean and Central America. These guys can be found in a wide variety of habitats. And basically anywhere that's open that they can hunt, you can find them as long as there's a perch. But their populations at a local level are small. And the reason for that is actually really straightforward. They're raptors. You can't have thousands of raptors sitting on top of each other trying, they won't survive, right? They compete with each other for food. And the higher on the trophic level you are, the less dense your food is, right? It's much easier if you're an herbivore to find some grass to munch than it is if you're a raptor to find a small prey item to eat. So there, that limit in food availability really restricts how many raptors can be in one spot. So local level populations are small. Rarity form 2. These are widely distributed with large local populations, but with a narrow habitat requirement. Red cockaded woodpecker is an example of this. This is a bird of the southeast that requires regularly burning longleaf pine forests. So it's a little bit like the ivory-billed woodpecker in that because of human management of these longleaf pine ecosystems and the fire suppression, there's serious problems for this woodpecker in its prevalence. It's just not found in a lot of places that it should be found because we mess with the normal fire regime. So currently it's only found in forests that are managed appropriately for it to survive. Form 3 are widely distributed birds with small local populations and narrowly specialized habitat. And this is something like piping plovers along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. Because here what you have are, you can see a wide distribution all along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast there. But they require, these sandy beaches, and they have very small local populations because they basically compete with people for sandy beach habitat. And so on any given beach, you will only find a handful of breeding pairs just because of the presence of humans. Rarity form 4, an example of this would be a gray trembler. So small geographic range, large local population, broad habitat tolerance. So essentially, this bird is only really limited by its geographic range. It's very tiny. There's plenty of them, and they don't really care about the habitat requirement. It's just the range is tiny. So, gray trembler is only found on 2 Caribbean islands, and they're small islands at that. So, if you looked at their population size at a global scale, it would be very small. But locally, they're really abundant. Form 5. This is the largest group of what we would call at-risk bird species, species that are at risk of becoming a conservation problem. Um, so these have a small geographic range, large local populations, high habitat specialization. So they're limited both in terms of geographic range and the habitat they need. And so this is a strange-tailed tyrant of Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina is an example of that. The range isn't very large, and they require this like tall grass type environment that's fairly moist. So like it's a moist tall grass species. If it's not a moist tall grass environment, they won't be there. They're very specialized toward that situation. Because of that, because of the combination of small range geographically and narrow specialized habitat requirements, when those habitats get altered or destroyed, it's a much more significant threat to this species. It's not like they have a big broad range where they can easily disperse out and just move into some other space. Their range is very short. Very short's not a good word for that. They're small, very narrow. And then rarity form 6. These are the most vulnerable species in the world. They basically have everything going against them. They are found over a very small geographic range. They have tiny local populations. And they have habitat specialization. And so here we have Bannerman's Turako, which has all three of these things going on. It's found geographically only in the highlands of Cameroon. They need tall fruiting trees in montane forests between the elevations of 1,700 and about 3,000 meters. So they're found just on these isolated ridges, and that's it. That means that they're incredibly susceptible to human influence. If we go in on a few of those ridges and mess things up for them, be very easy to local level for a local level extirpation to occur, which would influence, of course, across their small geographic range, their overall ability to sustain themselves. This is the table from the book. It just summarizes that. Note there are a couple examples here of the NAs. These are situations that might apply to other groups of organisms but don't typically apply to birds. That's why they're there. That's why they're NAs. So what are the major threats to bird populations? Well, many of them are things that you have heard me say in the other lectures, things like habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, habitat alteration, which I don't actually have listed on here, introduced predators, that's like the stoats in New Zealand we just talked about, direct exploitation, things like subsistence hunting, chemical toxins and pollution, climate change, and disease. Now, disease is not something we've talked about very much in this class. It is relevant to some avian populations quite a lot, actually. A good example of this is the Apapane of Hawaii. When mosquitoes were introduced to Hawaii, they are a vector of malaria. Malaria affects birds. And very quickly, a number of species succumbed to malaria and went extinct in Hawaii. Hawaii has a lot of problems with birds. It's not a great situation in Hawaii. The Apapane, though, has survived that, and the reason is because they exist across a range of elevations, and the individuals at higher elevations avoid the mosquito. Basically, the mosquito or mosquitoes, I don't know which, If it's a singular species vector, I'm not actually sure about that. But the mosquitoes, um, they don't go up that high in elevation. So while the lower elevation species succumb to malaria, the Apopinae is okay. All right, this is just some general information about populations and kind of tying it into conservation. So some of this is stuff that was already covered in the population chapter, but we'll just go over it fairly quickly. Uh, Recall the idea of stochasticity. So I think we talked about that in the population chapter, but now that I'm thinking back to it, I don't know if they actually had that in the population chapter, which is crazy. So stochasticity was stochasticity. Stochasticity is randomness. Um, it's natural randomness in a population size. And so there's always some amount of randomness in a population size. It's not like if uh, there's no predation that the population size will just keep increasing, for example, or it'll stay perfectly stable. There is natural flux that's caused by all sorts of background environmental conditions. It could just be something like food availability, or rainfall, parasites, the things that are essentially random in their impacts that drive these staggering fluctuations in or staggered fluctuations in population size every year. This is just examples of stochasticity. You're seeing these estimated population sizes, and the you don't know exactly what processes are creating the jagged line of population size, but you know that there's something underlying that that's creating that randomness. So allele effects are a decrease in per capita reproductive success with decreasing population size. Do believe that you should be familiar with this already, but allele effects, what this is when a population size decreases. If it gets very small, it can get to the point where the smaller it gets, the lower the average reproductive success of every individual in the population is. Um, and that keeps getting, and that it's a feedback loop, because once their reproductive success is lower, in the next year their population will get smaller again, and their reproductive successes will get smaller again, and it creates a feedback loop of death. It's not good. So an example of this that ties back to the beginning of the lectures, the passenger pigeon. So the passenger pigeon, after the last hunt in Michigan, where they were on the roost, they weren't supposed to be killed at that time, but hunters went up to the roost and killed them right in the trees they were sitting in. Uh, there were still some individuals alive. It's not like they went up to the roosting sites, killed every single passenger pigeon, and that was the end of the story. Some survived. Some moved on to other places. But the population was far too small at that time to sustain itself anymore. That's sort of the example of an allele effect. There was no way for it to come back at that point. Genetics is so important in conservation. Protecting genetic diversity is one of the most crucial aspects of good conservation action. If you have sexual reproduction with a highly varied gene pool, you get strong, robust genetics within the population. If you have a lot of incestuous inbreeding type situation, you will get generally reduced, weaker genetics. Luckily, in birds, just intuitively in birds, they don't do that. Most birds avoid any sort of pairing with a relative. So it's an incest taboo within avian species. Genetic drift. So genetic drift is just random change in allelic diversity in a population over time. So you can imagine in very small populations that you have rare alleles. And it is possible through random chance, through stochastic processes, that those alleles that are rare might actually be completely eliminated from a population. A simple example of this, not birds, this is just like the most generic example I can think of. If I was just teaching this to undergrads or something, it's what I would talk about. You've got an island, and you've got, say, iguanas or some kind of lizard, whatever. And you have a bunch of red ones, but you've only got one blue one, okay? And that one blue one is sitting under a palm tree, and a coconut falls and hits it on the head and kills it. That was the only blue one. So it's the only individual carrying the gene for blueness. We're not going to get into heterozygousness or anything. Let's not overcomplicate this. The point is that's essentially a completely random event that just eliminated that rare allele from the population. Now that allele doesn't exist anymore. That's genetic drift. Random sort of chance just changed the frequency of alleles in that population for, in this case, color. That's genetic drift. This is problematic because that genetic material, those alleles, that's what evolution, that's what natural selection, I should say, works with and works on. And so if blue at any point could become advantageous and help the survival of that species, it can't do that anymore because it doesn't exist. Natural selection can't select for alleles that aren't present. Okay. Inbreeding depressions are what happens when a population becomes very small. Basically, you get reduced survival and fertility of offspring that are related to those individuals. You get a genetic depression. Genetic bottleneck is essentially what you get when stochastic events limit genetic variation such that the ability of the population to adapt to a changing environment is reduced and birth rate declines and death rate increases. So this is the bottleneck here is are your stochastic events. You have a wide bottleneck which lets more variability in genetic material through, or a tight bottleneck which lets relatively little genetic variation through. So this is just how do these stochastic processes impact what alleles make it to the next generation or the next population. Obviously, the wider the bottleneck, the better, because you retain more genetic diversity in that case. Ultimately, the interaction between the environment, the demographics of the population, and genetic diversity or pressures on genetic diversity, however you want to think of that, all work together and can ultimately cause populations to decrease when things are working against them, right? When stochastic processes are affecting genetic diversity, when demographic structure, which we talked about 2 chapters ago, is very off kilter. So you have lots of old and lots of young, but not enough breeding individuals, for example. And when environmental effects are deleterious to the population. All these things can work together to drive the population size down, either by reducing birth rates or increasing death rates, or manipulating immigration or emigration. As that population decreases, eventually it will get so small that you can get an allele effect. And of course, when you have an allele effect, it creates a nasty feedback loop, which will quickly drive a population smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually into extinction. So we can model this like a vortex, which you have here, the spiraling vortex. That's called the extinction vortex. All right, I know that we're over an hour on this one, but to be fair, the last two big lectures were actually under, so I'm going to take the extra time to talk about a few other things from this chapter. Population size. A good question to ask yourself is do all activities that we do have a negative effect on avian population size? Like, it's all the things we talk about human or anthropogenic impacts on species as though we only have negative effects on species, but that's not actually true. Um, Sometimes there are trade-offs. One species benefits while one doesn't, while one is harmed by our activity. So an example is bobolink. When we were cutting all the forests down in the east, over 100 years ago now, but when we were doing that, um, the bobolink loved that because the bobolink doesn't want forest, it wants grassland, and that's what we were essentially creating is lots of grassland, lots of more open habitat for that species. Today, as forests regenerate, in a lot of those places where there were bobolinks, there aren't bobolinks anymore. Instead, you get things like the red-bellied woodpecker, which is much more prevalent. So human activity is not like zero-sum, always negative thing. It depends on context. Sometimes there are cascading effects. If you look at in parts of the range of the snow goose in Canada where land has been converted into farmland, it increased the wintering area for snow geese tremendously. And these snow geese, they love this. They go around and they actually pull plants up by the roots when they're foraging. And so for them, it's great. It's this great thing. Um, Not so great though for the lesser yellowlegs because what happens is you have a cascading effect because of the foraging behavior of the snow goose or the snow geese, lesser yellowlegs and similar species to them. When they come to these areas to forage, there's no forage because the plants are literally ripped up by the roots. This has a negative effect on the lesser yellowlegs. So it's a cascading effect because our effect increased one population size, and the actions, the behavior in this case of that population, reduced the population size of a different species. So it's a cascade through multiple species. Okay, so how do we achieve conservation? Well, we have to set priorities, and we set priorities. We have a process called triage. Triage is a medical term, and just as a generic, quick overview of triage, the idea in medicine is like if you have, let's say you have three people come into the ER. One person has a possum bite on his face, like me. Um, One person is was in a car crash and is just barely alive, and one person has a severe, wound, um, and if they aren't seen very quickly, could die. Well, so me in that situation, I'm not very important to get to right away. Like I'm probably not dying from this. It needs attention. It needs stitched up, right, etc. The the individual, the second individual that's like completely mangled to the point of almost dead, you might say like, well, try to save him because he's the most close to death. But the reality might be in triage, and this is an ugly reality, but it's true, is that some people may, not just people, some species, right, can be so far gone that they cannot be saved. The soldier that maybe has a bullet wound to the head. I hate to be, you know, brutal in my explanation or disturb anyone. It's the reality of the world. They might live. You can get shot in the head and live, but it might be impossible or nearly impossible to save that person. They might be essentially all. It's like that person's. There's no way they can make it. We can't save that person. That's what triage does. It assesses that. So you take the person, the third person, the person that has a severe wound, that if they're not seen will die, but is not so close to death that they're not savable. That's triage. It's setting a priority amongst a series of all, unfortunate options in this case. In conservation, we can use the same principles. We can look at species and say, like, that species, we could put billions of dollars into that species and we could never save it. That species, it's not done great, but it's nowhere near extinction. That species is pushing toward extinction. And if we put a reasonable amount of time and effort into it, we can probably stabilize that population. That's the one that you want to put your resources into, right? Don't put your resources into one that can't be saved, and don't waste your time on ones that don't currently need the effort. Now, there are some arguments against that are, when you take ZooCon, if you take the ZooCon class, we'll talk about that more. But um, primarily we're going to focus on the ones that need the saving and can't be saved. Some ways we set these priorities are looking at things like the genetic distinctiveness of a given species, the taxonomic distinctiveness. So taxonomic distinctiveness might be confusing, like what's that? Well, there are some families of birds, actually many families of birds, that only have a single species that represents that entire evolutionary lineage. And if you lose that species, you literally lose the whole evolutionary lineage. So the kegu is an example of this. In Rhinochettidae, if it goes, Rhinochettidae goes, we lose the whole family. So we might want to put more effort into conserving a species like that. Endemism, endemics are a big deal. In a lot of places, you'll have like islands with many endemics to that island. Hawaii is an example of that. And when you can uh, take a conservation action in that region, you can actually like protect several different species at once. All these endemics that need protection. Places that are biodiversity hotspots, maybe places where we want to really focus efforts because there's just tremendous diversity in that one area. Obviously, in general, species that are listed vulnerable or endangered. And then species which have a very important ecological role, maybe they're critical seed dispersers, and without them, we'll lose multiple plants that they're required to spread that plant around. And then utilitarian role. What does the species do for humans? That's what the utilitarian role is. Does the species do something for us? Because we want to consider that as well. So those are some of the ways we can set priorities. How do we manage exploitation? Well, the wood duck is a good example of managing exploitation. So the wood duck, in the early 1900s, this was one of the most prevalently hunted species. And it was hunted to the point that they were very exceedingly rare. Duck hunting is actually big today, whether you know that or not, but it was very, very big back then. It was, a very popular sport. But what happened is the government said we are going to completely eliminate the wood duck season. Like there will be no more wood duck hunting, and we're going to do this, and we're going to continuously monitor the wood duck, the population, until it recovers. And they did that. So in 1918, they got rid of it. They enforced it. They uh, they used the right sort of messaging that would resonate with hunters. You're not saying like you can't hunt the bird anymore. It's more like if you would, like this bird's valuable, and if we want to continue to have this bird and to be able to hunt it in the future, right now we need there to not be a hunting season. We need no one to kill these birds. And it worked. And by 1941, the population of wood ducks had increased enough that they were able to reopen wood duck hunting season. And by that time, culture had shifted a bit, and they weren't as the regulations were better for more reasonable for harvest, and well, now we have wood ducks today because of all of that. So it is unlikely, as zoo professionals, any of you will be asked to design a reserve. But it's an interesting thing to think about how one would design, say, if you could just design a national wildlife refuge any way you wanted to, how you might do that. Um, so, what sort of conditions do you need to consider? Well, a few things. First, let's go over here. Better, or better, yeah. Bigger is always better than worse. I think I had a stroke. Bigger is always better than smaller. Big, good. Small, bad. That's the point. Shape. Uh, Round or square is a lot better than elongate. Okay. Elongate, you get edge effects from elongate. I mean, every habitat patch has an edge, but when you make very elongate habitats or reserves, you create edge effects. So imagine like, this is a forest and this is a forest, but this is this elongate forest. Look at all of this long edge that you've created, this forest edge. Edge effects, what they are, they're changes in population structure that happen toward the edge of a habitat as you transition between two habitats. And there are species that are edge specialists, so that edge might be great. But for species that want this interior region, something like a circle or a square is going to be better. The number of reserves is going to be important. 2 is better than 1. 3 is better than 2, etc. Their proximity. Closer together is better than farther apart. It permits uh, easier movement between patches, right? The arrangement is also an important consideration in terms of that movement or that dispersal between patches. So just think about, let's just call this circle here, this patch, this particular reserve, reserve 1. To go from reserve 1 to 2, 3, or 4 is, in this particular situation, much easier than it is to go from 1 to any of these here, because these are all in this cluster and these are in this linear arrangement. So to go from here to here is this 1 unit of distance, whatever that is. From here to here is 2 units of distance, and from here to here is 3 units of distance. It's a much harder dispersal. And then finally, connectivity. In between your reserves, you have to consider how animals might move through those spaces to get between the different patches. Is there the necessary stopover locations, for example, or uh, general, like, is there a thin strip of habitat that they might feel comfortable moving through? If you have, a reserve here and a reserve here in a city in between, for many animals, there's no connectivity between those two reserves because the animals here are not going to move across the cityscape to get to the space over here, and vice versa. So those are some of the things that you have to consider in that case. A couple other things. So probably one of the most important things from a zoo perspective when you're thinking about conservation is captive breeding. Um, so when we talk about captive breeding, it's very important to understand the role of genetics in this. Zoos keep stud books on their animals so they can track genetic lineages. This is extremely important because it ensures that you can create genetically diverse mating pairs. And when you're talking about conservation, as we just discussed a few minutes ago, genetics is king. Genetics is everything. So uh, these stud books are super important. And this is something that zoos do. So that's great. This example here, this picture is of a Hawaiian crow. In the 1990s, there were only like a dozen or so birds in the wild. And now there's about 120, or probably actually more than that now. 120 when the book was published. Uh, and that is in large part due to genetic augmentation of captive bred Hawaiian crows using these well-tracked genetic lineages to create genetically diverse individuals to introduce into the wild population. So genetic rescue. This is a somewhat similar example. Here we have greater prairie chickens, and you can see uh, the range in historic range here on the map. The darker, I guess that's a bluish purple color, whatever color that is the current range, and then the light colors the historic range. You see they're very limited compared to their historic range. In southern Illinois, in particular, uh, historically the population uh, was very, very small, and their hatch rates were very low, and they were dropping constantly. There was a negative trend in hatch rates, and that's what this is hatch rate right here. Um, if you imagine drawing a fitted line to these points, ignore this, just looking up to about 1990, you would be like, yeah, that is very clearly a downward trend. Even if you eliminated this very bad year from the equation, this is a downward sloping trend of hatch rate. So this population in southern Illinois was going to eventually become extirpated. It's going to be extinct in that part of its range. What happened is to reinvigorate the genetics of the population, conservation biologists got individuals from some of the larger populations in Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota, and they brought them to southern Illinois. They brought these genetically more robust males in. And so they introduced these individuals into the population, and what you see is a recovery in hatch rate and uh, ultimately the stabilization of that population. So that's genetic rescue. I told you we'd get to translocation. So translocation is a weird one, and there are all sorts of issues that we could bring up with translocation. The big thing with translocation, the idea here is that we're going to move an animal from one place to another place to dodge threats to that animal. So the example here is the Chatham Rob. In 1980, there were only 5 individuals on the planet. Like, that was all that was left. They were being pushed to extinction by invasives. What happened was that they were moved to a place called Mangier Island from Chatham Island. And on Mangier Island, there were no predators. And on that island, of those 5 individuals, actually a single breeding pair, really ended up being responsible for the complete recovery of that species. Now, there's an obvious problem here. You have just a couple individuals really giving rise to the whole population on this island. So the obvious problem is the genetics are now not great. If you read in the book, it talks a little bit about this, but undoubtedly there are some serious genetic issues in that population. But there are at least a couple hundred that exist now. They are managed reproductively as best as they can be, and at least they persist currently. So that's the idea of a translocation. If they had stayed on Chatham Island, they would have gone extinct for sure. All right, let's wrap it up with what can you do? Well, obviously, some of you, or the vast majority of you, are in zoos, so you can become more active in your zoo's conservation programs. You can go off and be hopefully supported by your zoo to actually participate in real conservation action as volunteers or as maybe as you move forward in your careers as leaders of your own conservation projects. So there's that. Be a scientist, right? Other things you can do, though, that are more simple are things like citizen science. you can use eBird and write checklists of the birds that you see on your commute to work. Um, that is legitimate science. You can manage your property to be bird friendly. You can make eco-friendly consumer choices. You can take youth birding and get youth excited about conservation. You can donate to conservation funds. There's all sorts of things you can do. Um, there's really, the limit is your imagination, is what I would say. So, with that, we have wrapped up the last lecture for the semester. And if you have any questions, uh, please reach out to me. As always, it has been a pleasure having you in class this semester.